denn diese Welt, eure Welt, unser Volk.
The face of evil in the 20th century, the awful legacy of Adolf Hitler. I'm Jane Pauley, and this is Time and Again.
The following program is brought to you in living color. Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you.
This is Lowell Thomas in New York. The Beatles emerged on the
And go, my fellow Americans.
I'm Fred Huntley, your host on...
We have 73 television cameras on Mayday Road.
President Nixon is actively...
One small step for man.
Hello and welcome to Time and Again. Adolf Hitler has been dead for decades, but his ghost haunts us still. His thirst for power triggered a world war that cost more than 20 million lives, including 6 million Jews, most of Europe's Jewish population. His ruthless exploitation of German anti-Semitism saw to that. Hitler was evil. He brought out the evil in others, and he's a reference point for evil in the modern world. The ethnic cleansing of Slobodan Milosevic, or the mindless slaughter in a Colorado high school deliberately staged, we're told, on the 110th anniversary of Hitler's birth. On this episode of Time and Again, a look at the most destructive, bewildering figure of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler.
How many of you recognize this voice?
Und ich weiß, so wie ihr in stolzer Ergebenheit diesem
Yes,
Deutschland...
it is Adolf Hitler speaking. 10 years ago today, his armies marched into Poland, thereby touching off World War II. Behind Hitler was a majority of the German people, swayed to fanatical patriotism by Der Führer's bombastic promises of a Superman's world. And it took 6 years before the Nazi leader, his henchmen, and his allies were crushed in the most costly and destructive war in history. Before the last gun was fired, an estimated 22 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians were killed, and more than 34 million were wounded. The total military cost is set at $1,117 billion.
NBC's John Cameron Swayze in 1949. World War II was born from the ashes of World War I. Hitler fought in that war and later rose to power, promising vengeance for Germany's humiliating defeat. After becoming chancellor in 1933, his propaganda machine inflamed national pride and anti-Semitism. He rearmed Germany and sent his armies on the march into Austria, then Czechoslovakia, then on September 1st, 1939, into Poland.
It had been a warm summer in Berlin, and Germans were savoring their new prosperity. Unemployment was low, and the thrilling torchlight parade, the rearmament, allowed Germans to forget the humiliating defeat of the First War. Hitler, like him or not, had restored the pride of the fatherland. But the party was coming to an end. The summer of '39 thundered to a close on September 1st. The Germans invaded Poland. Nazi planes bombed Warsaw. It was war.
Here, Mr. William L. Shirer, we take you now to Berlin.
The military operations against Poland continue.
And millions of Americans heard the reports of correspondent William L. Shirer.
That successful progress was made on all the other fronts, and that the German Air Force, in bombarding Polish airfields, destroyed many Polish planes.
Shirer had just fallen into bed on the dawn of the 1st when word came.
And I think at 5:30 or 6, telephone rang with a colleague of mine, Sigrid Schultz of the Chicago Tribune. She just said, "Bill, it's happened." And I got out of bed and poured a lot of cold water over me and went out to broadcast.
Today, William L. Shirer is 85. In his home in western Massachusetts, he's surrounded by files and cases of old reporters' past, the raw notes of his years as witness to the rise and fall of Nazi Germany.
My first assignment in Berlin was to go down and cover Hitler at Nuremberg. A wonderful way to get into that mad Third Reich. I completely misjudged him. I couldn't imagine this guy having captured Germany. He seemed insignificant to me. You know, it was very common for all of us to sneer and say he was a house painter and so forth. The truth is, subsequently, was that he was a genius, an evil genius to be sure, but a genius.
It's not fashionable these days to talk about good and evil. Was he evil? Was there evil then?
There was a great deal of evil, yes. I mean, any government which could conceive an idea of massacring a whole race of people because of their race, to think of tens of thousands of Germans involved in the extinction of the Jews, counting the gold teeth when they came back, and the fact that there was no tremendous outrage.
In the 30s, Hitler had given the Germans what they wanted, and the showcase of the Third Reich was the 1936 Olympics. Shire remembers American visitors to Berlin being mesmerized by it all.
And they would say, why, what is this stuff you've been sending all the time? I mean, they're happy people, but they didn't know, of course, what was going on behind the scenes. To see the collapse of that culture and the collapse of this great people, I would guess that 85% of the German people by 1936, when he went into the Rhineland, were for Hitler. Not just for him, but for him with enthusiasm.
We wonder now how it could have happened. Berlin theater critic Friedrich Luft was a drafted soldier during the war. He didn't like Hitler, but he saw the appeal.
He was saying often these things. Germany is the greatest country in the world, and we'll eliminate everybody who's against us, and the Jews are evil, and we'll have to tramp them out, and then people wanted to hear that. They loved it.
If you go to Berlin today to find the remains of the Reich, you'll see there's not much left. A mound of weeds that was Gestapo headquarters, tucked away nearby a small photo exhibit of the Gallery of Horrors. Does everybody ask you why? Is there an answer?
I really cannot tell you why. I can only tell you I saw it happen in the years I was in Berlin, and it shocked me, and I tried to understand it. I tried ever since to understand it, and I can't do it.
Dennis Murphy filed that report in 1989, 50 years after the start of World War II, and just weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall, an event that heralded the end of the Cold War. Still to come, how did a destitute painter become the most feared man in the world? The rise of Adolf Hitler when Time and Again continues. Adolf Hitler's father was born out of wedlock to a woman named Maria Anna Schicklgruber. He grew up in the home of a miller named Johann Hitler and took that name as his own when he was 39. He married his third wife in 1885, and 4 years later, in Braunau, Austria, Adolf Hitler was born. His parents died before he was 20, and his early life was marked by failure. He lived in near poverty, and after the start of World War I, he joined the army. He was unexceptional, yet different, a voracious reader, a passionate anti-Semite, and it would turn out a gifted, even mesmerizing public speaker. After the war, in the early 20s, Hitler found his calling in the Nazi Party.
Adolf Hitler, an obscure but brilliant Austrian rabble-rouser, is the leader of the German Nazis, and he tells them, "The principle of democracy is the principle of destruction. Only force rules. Struggle is the father of all things. Virtue lies in blood. Leadership is primary and decisive." The demand of Hitler is a cry for violence. Violence against the Republic and destruction of the Versailles Peace Treaty, which shackles German militarism. Violence against the Jews and destruction of all who question the racial superiority of the Germans. Says Hitler, "We will incite the people. We will lash them to a frenzy." He does. He began with 7 men in the back room of a Bavarian beer hall. 4 years of time and 4 years of continuing despair net him a following that hails him as der Führer, the leader, and sees in him the hope of Germany. His speech has strange powers to rouse and inflame an audience. It is our mission to cause unrest. We shall see to it that disorder arises, that there is no quiet in the world. Intoxicated by public acclaim, overestimating his political strength, Adolf Hitler, in November of 1923, stages his first revolution, an armed march through the streets of Munich to overthrow the government of the state of Bavaria and seize power. But the state is still stronger than the Nazi party. The Führer is the first to flee as 16 of his stormtroopers lie dead or dying in the street. But he fails to escape and is sentenced to prison for treason. At the age of 35, his career seems over before it fully started. So it seems in 1923. But Adolf Hitler never doubts, never, his destiny. In prison, he writes a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he boldly decrees his program for conquest and oppression. The world ignores him, but the seeds have been scattered, and they find their soil. Released from jail through political influence, he is back at the head of his private army, whose creed is, Europe and the rest of the world can perish in flames. What is that to us? Germany must live and be free. And to the German youth, Hitler says, you are today the defense of a movement which is called to revolutionize Germany someday from the bottom up. This man becomes the mythical symbol of hope for myopic thousands of all ages, all classes. But Adolf Hitler means to be more than a mere symbol for thousands. He means to be absolute master of Germany's 62 millions. And on Germany's millions, he turns the power of his dark, demonic personality, the flood of his impassioned oratory. His method is a thousand-fold repetition of a few simple points, a few shoddy ideas. Germany, he says, was never defeated. She was stabbed in the back by Jews and traitors at home. The pure Aryan Germanic race is destined to rule the world. Only a strong man, a dictator, can save Germany from red revolution and democratic weakness. He appeals to patriotism and to national pride, to hatred and to resentment. Always and everywhere, the appeal of this master of opportunism is emotional, irrational. He says, reason can treacherously deceive a man, but emotion is sure and never leaves him. And, he says, I fanaticize the masses in order to make them a tool of my policy. His only real policy, his only real program, power without limit.
As a political candidate, Hitler told Germans they were still the victims of World War I and promised to lead them to glory. His own brown shirts brought violence and chaos to the streets, and he promised order. He promised industrialists he would fight communism, and they contributed large sums of money for his political campaigns. Hitler's National Socialist Party did not have a majority in the Reichstag, the German parliament, when President Hindenburg named him chancellor of a coalition government, believing that way Hitler could be controlled. He called for an election, but a week before the people were to vote, a suspicious fire destroyed the Reichstag building, which Hitler blamed on the communists. It led to the suspension of laws, the jailing of the political opposition, and began a new chapter of inhumanity. There have been other tyrants who lusted after power, but this was Hitler's legacy, institutionalized killing. He began wholesale slaughter inside his own country long before there was a war. How did Hitler gain this power to commit mass murder with 12 million victims, 6 million of them Jews?
And it was always a minority that terrorized the majority. One must resist from the very beginning. The moment you let fascist or other whatever element which exists in every society, the potential is there. If the majority lets this minority terrorize the rest, it's lost.
Adolf Hitler was not resisted from the beginning. While many expressed admiration or looked the other way, Hitler rebuilt Germany's war machine, brutally suppressed the opposition, and dreamed of conquest. Hitler takes Austria when Time and Again continues.
Another and uglier reminder of the Viennese past is the picture in the memory of 1938 and the arrival of Adolf Hitler. The public reception in streets and squares now peaceful again. Hitler spent his young manhood in Vienna as a bum. He was welcomed back as a hero, but nobody will admit it now.
NBC's David Brinkley reporting from Vienna, Austria in 1962, 24 years after Adolf Hitler returned to the country of his birth and claimed it for Germany. It was called the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by the Third Reich. Hitler was redefining Germany's borders by force, restoring its military might in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles imposed after the First World War. And while his dreams of a greater Germany sent a chill through Europe, Hitler was not stopped. Scenes like this were repeated again and again as the Nazis took Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Northern Africa, the Balkans, Greece. By June 1940, Hitler was in Paris. Even France was his. In June 1941, the German army invaded Russia in what would prove to be Hitler's downfall. England suffered relentless Nazi bombing. The United States was actively supporting England but would not openly join the war until late 1941. So Hitler had a fearsome head start, and it started here in Austria in 1938. Austria was where Hitler had been born almost 50 years earlier. How is he remembered there? NBC's Phil Bremen paid a visit in 1983.
Braunau, Austria, on the River Inn, a town so conscious of its past that it has two statues of one mayor of 400 years ago simply because he had a long, splendid beard. But nowhere in the guidebooks and brochures will you find Braunau's biggest claim to fame. In the museum, not one exhibit on this city's most famous son. Only in the old church, among the births registered in April 1889, is he acknowledged. Hitler, Adolf. Hitler spent only his early childhood in Braunau. He was born here in this building, so the city council had a hole cut in the wall for a plaque. This plaque, proclaiming never again fascism. It pays tribute to millions of the dead and calls for peace, freedom, and democracy. But the owner of the building, it is still privately owned, wants nothing to do with any plaque.
Where Hitler is born, okay, it's a case, but it's my own house. I got it from my family.
Today, the owner took the government to court. Her lawyer said, put the plaque anyplace else, maybe City Hall. The government said, no thanks. The judge suggested forgetting about the plaque and destroying the building to get rid of Hitler's legacy once and for all. The case won't be settled for months. Officials admit there are a few Nazis here even now. But for the most part, the people of this city seem to oppose the plaque simply because it brings back unpleasant memories. If they cannot erase the past, they at least want to hide it.
The owner of the house prevailed. No plaque was erected. 6 years later, in 1989, a stone was placed in front of the house, quarried from the site of a former Nazi death camp, with an inscription remembering the millions who died in the Holocaust. The house was then a daycare center for handicapped people, the very sort Hitler would have put to death. When we come back, Hitler's willing executioners, a look at the responsibility of the German people for the Holocaust, and memories of Adolf Hitler by two men who knew him, Hitler Youth leader Baldur von Schirach and Minister of Armaments Albert Speer. In a moment.
This is NBC News at this hour.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lori Stokes in the news at this hour. So far, so good as far as the Y2K bug is concerned. Banks across the nation appear to have met the Y2K challenge, with ATMs turning out money without problems. Travel-related Y2K fears have also proven unfounded. Transportation Secretary Rodney Slater says that there have been no Y2K-related disruptions to air traffic, highway traffic, or rail service. And power and water are flowing without problems across the country. 8 power plants in the East and Midwest experienced a computer glitch, but power never went out, and the problem was quickly corrected. The party's over. The new millennium is here. The cleanup is well underway in New York's Times Square after about 2 million people gathered to watch the famous ball drop. project is expected to take at least 24 hours. In Boston, city workers are sweeping up confetti, another remnant from last night's festivities. Crowds in Beantown rang in the New Year's 5 separate countdowns throughout the city. President Clinton and the First Lady say they hope the unity and peace that mark the world's millennium celebrations will continue far into the future. The Clintons delivered a joint New Year's message from the White House this morning. The president says America's fate is tied to other nations.
Nearly 55 years ago, President Franklin Roosevelt said that we cannot live alone at peace. Our own well-being is dependent on the well-being of other nations far away, and therefore that we must be citizens of the world, members of the human community.
Mrs. Clinton says the U.S. must lead by example, extending prosperity and education to those in need. A shooting rampage by a distraught father has left a Pennsylvania family dead. Authorities in Reading, Pennsylvania say a man called 911 early this morning and told operators he had just shot his family. The parents and their 3 children were dead when police arrived at the scene a short time later. On his first full day in office, acting Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Russia forces in Chechnya. Praising the truce, Putin said that the war in Chechnya was aimed at stemming the breakup of the Russian Federation. Putin has adamantly supported the war and had defended Russia against Western criticism of the offensive. Putin was named acting president after Boris Yeltsin's surprise resignation yesterday. And there's no denying that this group is diving right into the millennium. More than 100 divers took a plunge in Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota today. It's the group's 10th year of this chilling New Year's tradition. The temperature at the time of the dive, a balmy 25 degrees with a wind chill of 10 below zero. Stay with MSNBC.
Up next, see the heroes of D-Day as Time and Again's special presentation on World War II continues on MSNBC.
Welcome back to Time and Again. It's sometimes said that if Adolf Hitler had died before World War II, before the Holocaust, he might have been considered a great man, a leader who rebuilt Germany's economy and restored its pride. The facts tell a different story. Hitler revitalized the economy by building a war machine that would devastate Europe. And the German pride he inspired was hateful, vengeful, anti-Semitic. The Jews were Hitler's all-purpose scapegoat, but he could not have slaughtered so many of them without plenty of help. There's a book about that, Hitler's Willing Executioners. John Hockenberry spoke with the author for Dateline in 1997.
It is from the ordinary German family that Adolf Hitler derives the immense power that he wields today.
It was a very large enterprise, an enormously large number of people involved, and this is the important fact.
Soft-spoken Professor Daniel Goldhagen doesn't like the big pictures of history. When you're talking about the Holocaust, he says, it's the little stories that matter most. They're also the most horrifying, and Goldhagen writes about them with unflinching graphic detail.
After the walk through the woods, each of the Germans had to raise his gun to the back of the head, now face down on the ground, that had bobbed along beside him, pull the trigger and watch the person, sometime a little girl, twitch and then move no more. At such close range, the Germans often became spattered with human gore.
Your critics have said the extent of this blow-by-blow description of horrible cruelty is pornographic, not academic.
The people who say that are really despicable. And what they're saying is that to describe a crime accurately is impermissible when the crime is the crime of the Holocaust.
In part what we try.
Going for brutal accuracy, this son of a Holocaust survivor says he's found a suspect in the crime of the century. And it's not some guy named Adolf.
First, the Nazi swastika is decreed the world's anti-Jew symbol.
Using wartime interrogations of the working-class Germans who joined the paramilitary killing battalions, he offers the controversial theory that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of ordinary Germans helped the Nazis. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. To them, exterminating Jews was just another day at the office.
I'm really surprised that it's deemed to be so controversial.
That when virtually all Germans needed no persuasion whatsoever to exterminate 6 million Jews.
but they do it because they think it's right, because in some sense they want to do it. That's essentially the argument.
It's like saying Bonnie and Clyde were murderers, right? Ergo, their families closely related to them by culture, political culture, psychology, and upbringing are murderers too.
German journalist Joseph Jaffe is one who has read the words of Daniel Goldhagen. Says the words sting. Never has an academic work woven horror and history together like this. Goldhagen's book was an instant bestseller in the United States. But what would modern Germany think of his broad condemnation of an entire country? Not surprisingly, German critics condemned it months before it made it onto the shelves.
It was frequently said by those who were writing that I was Jewish, and because of my background, that I could not be an objective scholar.
Is the fact that you are Jewish and that your father is a survivor irrelevant?
It is irrelevant to the conclusions of my book.
But when his book was finally published in Germany, Goldhagen decided to take his academic pride straight to the nation he had indicted. During a nationally televised book tour, Goldhagen agreed to face his angriest critics. Security for these academic lectures was tight. And while he doesn't come across like a guy looking for a fight, mild-mannered Daniel Goldhagen was walking into the lion's den.
Yeah, I'm not reading your gruesome descriptions today, but I just say again, think of what it would mean to shoot a child at point-blank range if you know you didn't have to do it.
You were confronting the children of the people who might have killed your parents, killed your friends, killed 6 million people whose relatives you might know today. I mean, that is a staggering confrontation.
I was going to the country to tell people that 50 years ago, most of the people in the country had done many criminal things. This is a very difficult thing to do.
The critics challenged his research, saying his sample was too narrow. They hammered at his conclusions, accusing him of stereotyping the Germans the way the Germans had stereotyped the Jews. But not only did Daniel survive the literary lions, to the ordinary Germans Goldhagen had gone to indict, he triumphed, and his book went straight to the top of the German bestseller list. A work about the Holocaust written by an American Jew that condemns an entire generation has become the best-selling academic work since the war's end.
I do believe that we have to face the fact that our parents were killers.
Daniel Goldhagen seems at ease with his past, happy and a little nervous about his newfound success. It's hard to tell Goldhagen's peaks from his valleys, but he told us his low point, the one moment when the brutality he was cataloging finally undid him. In the dusty old library where he read a story of cruelty that shocked. A 10-year-old Jewish boy adopted by a German commander was given a gun to be used against his own people.
It is believed that he killed his own mother. There is a perversion here that stands out even in this period in which each tale of horror seems incapable of being surpassed. This story did shake me.
All books of Jewish authors are ordered burned in the public squares. Authors,
Are you an agent for Germans coming to grips with the Holocaust?
I think that my book has become one, and the more we understand about why these things have happened in the past, the more likely we are to be able to work against something like this happening in the future.
Many Germans in the 30s and 40s were swept up in Nazi fever. Many others were swept away. But there were a very few, who tried to stop Hitler. In July 1944, one group tried to kill him, and they paid for it with their lives.
Relatives paid tribute this morning in West Berlin, where brothers, husbands, and sons had been hung from meat hooks. Some of the Germans who almost assassinated Adolf Hitler 40 years ago today. The ringleader was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, depicted in this NBC television reenactment. Badly wounded in battle, he believed his destiny was to try to stop Hitler from wasting any more lives. Stauffenberg smuggled a time bomb in a briefcase into a staff meeting, then left the room. But someone nudged the briefcase out of the way, and Hitler was barely scratched. Shaken and furious, Hitler had Stauffenberg and other conspirators rounded up and executed that same day. Their families were also punished, but Stauffenberg's widow and son look back in pride as well as grief. Franz Stauffenberg says his father must have known the plot would probably fail, but history would show someone at least tried. Historians point out there was no mass opposition to Hitler's war or his concentration camps, but there were many less spectacular acts of resistance by clergymen and communists, aristocrats and labor leaders, a cross-section of German society.
When we come back, two of Hitler's top aides who spent years in jail remember their Fuhrer. Leader of the Hitler Youth, Baldur von Schirach, and head of war production, Albert Speer, in a moment.
Der Führer der deutschen Jugend hat das Volk.
For 12 years, starting in 1933, the Third Reich was a brutally efficient engine of death. Reporting to Adolf Hitler was a vast Nazi organization, some of the key players, and what happened to them. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's notorious minister of propaganda. Goebbels committed suicide as the Allies closed in on Berlin. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Gestapo, obsessed with racial purity. Himmler was captured but committed suicide before he could be put on trial. Adolf Eichmann, who personally directed the mass deportation of Jews to the death camps. He escaped after the war and fled to South America. Captured in 1960, he was tried in Israel and executed. Hermann Goering, in charge of the Air Force, the economy, the Jewish question. Tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to death, he committed suicide. Martin Bormann, Hitler's right-hand man, he escaped the bunker at war's end and disappeared. Tried in absentia and sentenced to death, his fate remains a mystery. Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, and then Hitler's man in Vienna. At Nuremberg, von Schirach pleaded guilty to crimes against humanity and served a 20-year sentence at Spandau prison. He was released in 1966 and soon after spoke with NBC's Garrick Utley.
As a young man, I was anti-Semitic. And that was, at that time, the feeling of almost the majority of the German younger generation. Naturally, we younger Germans of that time never even thought of the possibility of a destruction of the Jews in Germany as Hitler afterwards wanted to carry out, and as we sadly must state now, actually did carry out.
Do you think Germany or yourself should be forgiven for what happened during the Nazi period?
Well, Mr. Attlee, this is a very strange question. As far as I am concerned, I think I have served my sentence.
You think the sentence was fair?
I am not talking about legal affairs. I am talking about moral guilt. My moral guilt I have confessed, and I have received punishment for it, and I accept that.
That was 1966. Von Schirach died 8 years later, the news somewhat drowned out by the resignation of Richard Nixon on the same day. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and minister of armaments, was also found guilty at Nuremberg for employing forced labor. He pleaded guilty and, like von Schirach, served 20 years at Spandau. In 1976, 10 years after his release, Speer spoke with Garrick Utley.
Why did you go to work for Hitler? Was it because you shared a political philosophy? Was it ambition? Or was it the, as you put it, the fascination of the man?
It was several things together. As often in life, several things makes a whole picture. And but first of all, it was a fascination when I listened to a speech which he made to students, to a student rally in 30 or 31.
And then I joined him. I didn't join so much the party, but joining him as a person. And then when I met him, and he was already this charming, kind man. And the third thing, which was as much as the other two things, of course, was ambition.
Was Hitler crazy?
No, I wouldn't say he was crazy, because craziness would be a too cheap excuse before history.
Let us say, if Hitler were alive today, and he were to walk into this house in Heidelberg, down into this living room, how would you react? How would you greet him, aside from surprise?
Today, I would call the police.
When Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach were released from Spandau prison in 1966, the only inmate left there was Rudolf Hess. He died in 1987, still a prisoner, managing to commit suicide at age 93 after 41 years behind bars.
For Rudolf Hess, being a Nazi was more religion than politics. He remained a fanatic to the end. He was one of Adolf Hitler's earliest and most devoted followers. Briefly imprisoned with Hitler in 1923, Hess became his secretary and confidant. Hess created the cult worship of the Fuhrer. Hess invented the phrase, Heil Hitler. And Hess rose to power with Hitler, becoming his deputy in charge of party affairs, never far from his Fuhrer's side. In the 1930s, Hess was a loyal aide, supporting the oppression of Jews and political opponents. But even the other Nazis found him bizarre and mentally unstable, and pushed him out of the inner circle as war approached.
He was not a powerful figure in 1939 when the war broke out. He was a has-been who was kept on out of the old time's sake.
Then, in 1941, Hess guaranteed his place in history in an act that is still surrounded in mystery. He flew to Scotland and parachuted in on an apparently unauthorized peace mission. He sought a truce with Great Britain before Germany attacked Russia. The British laughed at him and threw him in jail. Hitler said he was insane, but the disastrous invasion of Russia was the beginning of the end for the Nazis. After the war, Hess was tried at Nuremberg and convicted. He said he regretted nothing, but he appeared to be a sick and broken man. For many years, Spandau's only inmate, he was seen by the world only in smuggled-out film, blurred images of a shadowy man. He died still a prisoner of the Allied powers his beloved Fuhrer had failed to conquer. Paul Miller, NBC News, Berlin.
When the end came to Nazi Germany, Hitler's minions scattered. But what became of the Fuhrer himself? Adolf Hitler's final days, when Time and Again continues.
Germany's cities lie in ruins, and the hopes of the Nazis lie in the dust. The gutted buildings of the Reich reveal the irresistible power behind the Allied drive, a power that all the vaunted Wehrmacht could not stop. Bismarck's statue frowns upon the shattered wreckage of a Krupp munitions plant, one of the many furnishing tools of war for the Blitzkrieg, Hitler's fast-paced warfare that was stopped cold and flung back in his face, as were these tanks which never left the assembly line. Nuremberg in southern Germany, the hotbed shrine city of Nazism, was overrun by the victorious Yanks. Of all the enemy's leveled cities, none reflects greater destruction than Nuremberg, where the Allied attack poured its full fury upon the spawning grounds of the Nazis. The haughty German eagle looks down on German dead, lying still in defeat. Over the vast stadium, Old Glory overshadows one of the world's most hated symbols. Here, where once thousands of swastikas flew above the goose-stepping troops, parading for the strutting Fuhrer, and where he ranted to the assembled thousands, the troops Hitler once laughed at take over. The swastika will no longer flaunt its crooked arms above the Nazi shrine.
Adolf Hitler took his own life just days before the war in Europe finally ended. putting a bullet through his head on April 30th, 1945. The 56-year-old Fuhrer had been living in a cramped underground bunker for months, his vaunted Third Reich collapsing around him as Allied armies closed in on Berlin.
By the time Hitler's private pilot took these pictures, the tide had already turned against Hitler and against his not always faithful ally Mussolini, whom Hitler never trusted, even though he'd borrowed some of his fascist symbols like the salute. Among this group of senior officers is Martin Bormann on the right, who was slowly working his way up to being Hitler's most trusted aide. By the last months of the war, Bormann was without a rival. But the man he served was deteriorating badly. This is probably the last film taken of him, as he reviewed members of the Hitler Youth defending Berlin. By now, he scarcely ever emerged from his bunker, 50 feet beneath the Chancellery, where this was filmed. One of the final visitors to the bunker was horrified. Hitler shook uncontrollably. His bloodshot eyes needed glasses to read typing 3 times normal size. Saliva dripped from his mouth. When Himmler betrayed him by trying to do a deal with the Allies, he went into the last of his wild rages. Then there followed a mood of calm. He married Eva Braun and made his will, and at 3:30 in the afternoon of the 30th, the two of them killed themselves. Nowadays, the bunker lies on the other side of the Berlin Wall in East Germany. Only a grassy heap of rubble marks the place where Hitler's body and that of Eva Braun were burned and then buried in a shell crater. And because it was Hitler's war, Hitler's death brought the war in Europe to an end.
Up next, see the heroes of D-Day as Time and Again's special presentation on World War II continues on MSNBC.
Adolf Hitler was pure evil, and he was in command of the most advanced technology and the best disciplined people and the best educated people in the world.
In the wrong hands, technology helped turn Europe into a slaughterhouse. This was a war that was also a crime.
Eisenhower, when he first encountered concentration camps, was shocked and surprised. He hadn't been told about it. His immediate reaction was, this is so horrible that there will inevitably become a revisionist movement someday to say this never happened. This is propaganda. This is a figment of wartime imagination. So he insisted that every GI who could be marched through those camps, and he said, bring your cameras with you.
Sergeant White was among the first to enter the Dachau concentration camp. A friend brought a camera.
The very atmosphere of that whole building was death. As we come into the crematorium itself, all we could see was dead bodies. And there was 8 furnaces that were going full blast. And I hope that our children never, never, never have to see anything like that.
On April 25th, 1945, U.S. forces linked up with the Russians on the banks of Germany's Elbe River. Berlin fell soon after. By May 8th, the war in Europe was over.
The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In this field in Arlington National Cemetery, you can count the cost of liberating Europe. In all, 175,000 Americans would die fighting there.
It was a madness never before seen in this world, and pray God never will be again.
Amen.
Adolf Hitler was the cause of so much suffering, so much devastation and death. He will likely never be fully understood. He was a man who in many ways was unexceptional, but he was able to rally Germany to his cause, and that led to calamity. Preaching hate and practicing it, his dreams of glory ended in failure. His dreams of a Europe free of Jews ended in disaster. We live in a world he helped create, even in defeat. The lessons are still there for the learning. That's Time and Again for now. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jane Pauley, and we're history.